Hi, Neha. Welcome. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm so happy to be joining you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so just a little background for the listeners. You and I met. I had the pleasure of meeting you because you came to Detroit to talk about your upcoming book, and I'm excited because everyone's gonna definitely want to read this. It's called The Power Pause, and we're gonna jump more into that. But I think one of the first things I said to you was like, "Thank you for coming to Detroit," because normally we get kind of hopped over. It's like New York and then Chicago. So we either have to go to Chicago to see somebody, and you came here, and it was a really beautiful, intimate sort of environment where there were a lot of parents and mostly mothers who were there to hear about your book and your work, and I had the pleasure of meeting you there. So I wanted to kind of start with one of the first conversations that we had, but also that you shared with the group, which is sort of how Mother Untitled and The Power Pause, which is your book and a lot of your work, like, tell us about how that came to be, but more specifically, this idea of like what it is to take a pause in your career with grace. And I think that's what you've sort of brought to light. So can you talk to us a little bit about how it even began for you and where the sort of work started?
Well, let me first say, I think some of my favorite parts of launching this book and doing all of this work is the women I get to meet who are really reshaping this conversation together. I think movements happen because of the women and the people that rally around it and share their stories, yours included. So, thank you for being in that room. I started this platform really because when I stepped into motherhood, I really did want to make more room for it. I was ready to take a break from the career I'd known. I'd been in brand marketing for 10 years. On paper, I had my dream job. I just graduated Stanford Business School, so sort of the expectations on my career were high. And from the outside, I checked all the boxes, right? And then I had Bodhi, and I finally felt this sort of sense of peace and belonging in my own skin that I'd probably been looking for a long time. And so I did initially downshift my career to 2 days a week. Eventually, I would pause, but pretty immediately I started hearing, well, are you giving up?
Mm.
What are you going to do all day? Why did you bother taking a spot at business school? And all of it, certainly, yes, hurtful, but I think more than anything, it really brought up for me just how antiquated the stereotypes and the conversation was around stay-at-home motherhood. And meanwhile, this was the girl boss movement and the lean in era. And so I started the conversation because I felt like we needed a new narrative about what it means to be ambitious and modern and still want to shift things up to have more room for family life.
Yeah, I loved that. When you shared your story, it really resonated because, I was probably one of the only ones in that room, maybe a couple of others who now have older kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I've kind of been through it. And I did make so many career shifts and I took pauses. And a lot of the things that you describe and a lot of the work you do, I was like, I wish I had her when my kids were, born. And I was trying to navigate some of these decisions because that was not the conversation at that
Mm-hmm.
time. And there really was nowhere to go. And I agree with you that those comments that people were saying to you, yes, hurtful and also normal, right? A very normal, expected comment for a lot of women who decided that they didn't want to be in a full-time role, but then also the struggle around feeling guilty and feeling like you
Mm-hmm.
put all this work into a career that in theory you probably loved. You said yourself it was your dream job on paper. So it really hit home for me when you were describing it, and I thought of my own sort of first pause and shift, and the response that I got was very similar. You have a specialized degree, why would you just throw that out the window? There was this sort of notion that I had taken what I had rightfully earned and it was now just no longer, right? It was no longer
Mm-hmm.
mine because I decided to make a shift or take a pause. And so I think it's so great because now people have more language around this and we can start to describe these pauses in part thanks to your work and to you putting these types of conversations out there for people to really think about and listen to. So I kind of wanted to go there next in the idea that why is it, do you think, and I think women in particular, but why do we identify so much with what we do? You know, I was listening to somebody earlier today actually, and she was saying like, when can we just stop asking that question? Like, what do you do? It's just like, hi, I'm so and so, I'll come blah blah, and what do you do? And I do this, and there is this kind of like doing all the time, this doing question. So I'd love to get your thoughts on like really reframing that question and like where we go from how to answer that when we make these shifts.
Well, the reality of that question is it's just embedded in the fabric of our culture, and it's sadly, I think, come to stand in for who are you? And, you know, I reflect back on when I had my traditional career, and I would say, in sort of 5 pithy words, I run brand at a tech startup. And so I run leadership position, brand, relatively creative, tech startup. I'm sort of a risk taker and I'm on top of trends. And so in a few short words, I was able to communicate my quote unquote identity, but the reality is we are so much more than that, right? My identity was so much more expansive than that. And I think one of the universal stumbling blocks for women when they step into a chapter of stay-at-home motherhood or a career pause or shift away from their traditional work is that they lose that pithy identifier and then they feel like they've lost their place in the conversation. And that's what the work seeks to do, is make sure women don't feel counted out. And the best way to do that is to give ourselves the power to say, this is actually my time to explore a more expansive identity. And maybe that starts with saying, I get to be with my kids right now. We'll see what comes next, right? Because now you're owning the choice. You're talking about how you're actually spending your time, which is spending time with your kids. And we'll see what comes next. This is one part of a very, very long game. And so, you know, I think that there's lots of language there that we can use. Some, you know, I heard this joke recently that someone was like, well, what do? I garden. You know, they're responding with their hobby, right? Like, and of course she was being facetious, but I think this ability to say, right now I get to be with my kids and I'm volunteering on the side, or I'm working on a new project, or I'm taking a class in, and then you're really speaking to your more whole self. And I think it also leads this chapter of your life with a sense of open-mindedness about it being temporary, but it also being a time for you to explore.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I love the idea of like looking at it as a more expansive period of time rather than as a limitation. I think for so many of us, we see it as like, oh no, it's going to, you know, I'm going to be obsolete in my field if I take this pause. I'm not going to be, you know, how do I continue to remain competitive, or whatever that language is that's telling you to keep going or keep doing. And I love the idea around this expansiveness, because for me, that's been true. Every time I've taken a pause, it's really stepping into the unknown. So whether that is to raise your children, whether that is to consider another idea or to pursue a dream, there is some uncertainty and some degree of unknown. And I think that's usually where the good stuff lives. It's where we kind of push ourselves and learn more about who we are and what we can do. So there were a couple of women that night, and we were chatting after your talk, and they had both, I think, mentioned in the conversation to you that they had just recently decided to take a pause, and they were struggling because they loved what they were doing, much like the way you described yourself. And they really were what I call kind of fast forward thinking, like wondering what it would mean for them in 5 years by taking this pause, or what will it mean for me in the next, whatever, you know, iteration of my career. What does this really mean when I walk away from this? And I had said to them, and I'm curious to get your thoughts, that kind of having some perspective on it because I'm further away from it than they are. I said, for me, I hear your story and I get super excited for you. Like, I get really like, ooh, this is so good. You're letting go, you're shedding something, and you're kind of stepping into this new space, and you start to invite all this goodness in. So what do you say to the mother? And I know you go over this in the book, and there's so many good tangible strategies for mothers to look at and to really consider and think about how it would apply to their own situation. But just on the surface, sort of, where would you even start with somebody who's playing that fast forward game?
Well, I think that uncertainty is uncomfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're navigating a moment where when things have been laid out for you, you know what's coming next. And I think that exactly what you said, there is the whole concept of a power pause is that actually by making room for family life, you're actually also ideally making room for yourself to grow alongside your kids. And those dots don't tend to make connect until they connect backwards and you're looking ahead 3 years. But there is a way in which to dignify this time and lay out a map for yourself that while you may not know where it leads, you'll know that you're growing in the day to day. And so I talk a lot in the book about a career pause not being a life pause. And by actively making room in your life at this stage, you can actually start to chart out, well, what are other ways I want to grow, right? What are ways I want to grow personally? What are ways I want to grow creatively? What are ways I might want to grow in my family life, right? Like, and that might be, I want to feel sillier in my day to day with my kids. I'm going to have a dance party every Monday. And it's like, by taking the intention and the time to say, I'm going to set these goals for myself. You're not saying, I'm going to set these goals and it's going to lead me exactly to where I want to be in 5 years. You're saying, I'm going to start to plant seeds for growth. And that way, you're not necessarily focused on the end outcome, but you're focused on the fact that you are still an evolving human being.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much. And I love that you have that mapped out for people in the book, because I do think sometimes that, like you mentioned, that unknown can have a lot of discomfort to it. And it's hard sometimes for us to find the ground under our feet when we're feeling that way. That's why I love a lot of the tools that you provide your readers and mothers who are in this, because it is a big shift. And it's also, I mean, outside of you, Neha, I don't really hear a lot of other people saying it or talking about it. There's still a lot around. I write a lot of times for the Every Mom. They're out of Chicago. And I've written articles about this idea of like the mommy wars and I think it's getting better. I'd love to know your thoughts on it. I mean, it feels that way to me in terms of my audience. But again, I don't know, because I do still sometimes see somebody say something like, when you step away from the workforce as a woman, it hurts all of us, right? There is sometimes this like collective identity around women and feminism and what we need to keep doing once we become mothers. And I think it's hard, right, to kind of take on that, to, put that on have the kind of the weight of the world on our shoulders. So what do you feel about that in terms of like that sort of idea of feminism being attached to every single thing we do, and then also the mommy wars? Like, is it getting better? Are we finding our way through that somehow?
This is obviously sits at so much of the heart of this work, which is that we never want to say a career break, a career pause, stay-at-home motherhood is better for anyone. We want to see more choices on the table that are all valid and dignified and respected and supported. And so, I get into this in the book, but if you look back to where this all started and where the mommy wars, quote unquote, came from, and where some of this judgment started to arise, it was that, we did so much in the 1970s to propel women into the workforce, improve our capacity in the workplace with the second wave of feminism. And so that was tremendous work, and we're grateful for it. But what happened during that time is anyone who chose to stay at home was pinned to the archetype that we saw in the 1970s with, June Cleaver, and from Leave It to Beaver, with those, cute print ads of the vacuum cleaners where women were sort of teetering around with a pink, dial-up phone and a plate of cookies. And we never really updated that perception. And so then we started to see in the 80s the working mother, quote unquote. There was a lot of content around that, and you saw Diane Keaton from the baby boom, and then you saw the 1970s June Cleaver, and that power chasm just kept growing and growing. And we started saying, well, one side is somehow better than the other, right? We would say, well, working mothers are a pillar of being modern, and they're modeling ambition for their daughters. And then we would say, well, stay-at-home mothers create more secure attachment for their kids. What we know in all of the research is that, like, children are not but the children are equally happy, equally ambitious in both of those scenarios, and it really is about a happy and healthy parent. And so, I think we made it about the kids, so that elicited defensiveness from both sides. The media loves a cat fight, so they glommed onto it and dubbed it the mommy wars. We saw that for the first time in the late 80s and early 90s. And it created this really divisive rhetoric. And now what we're realizing is, well, careers are a much longer game. Women are having children much later, so at the average age of 30, which means they've clocked in some degree of education as well as experience before having children, work experience. They have more equitable relationships with their partners, right? Like dads are spending 3 times the amount of time with their kids than any generation prior. And they have access to so many tools and technologies that they're able to either stay creative, stay learning, in many cases stay connected to income opportunities, whether they're creating or freelancing. And so we just see what I think of as this sort of vast gray area between the black and white ideas of stay-at-home and working mother. And that, to me, is the end goal, that we sort of dismantle this static version of stay-at-home motherhood, because what we know in the research is that 1 in 3 women working out of the home right now will pause their careers in the next 2 years. 1 in 2 will downshift their careers in their next 2 years, and 90% of women on career breaks aim to return to the workforce. So what we want to see is this much more fluid narrative where we recognize that every mother is mothering and every mother is working, and it's shifting over and over. And I think as we put this language forward, as we start to recognize the value of caregiving, as we all advocate for more solutions for women to stay connected to work that works, I do see us coming together around it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think in part, honestly, I think it is work like yours, and I think books like yours, and I think the messaging that you are putting out there is really, I always kind of say, even with the parents that I work with, and if we're talking about behaviors or emotions or whatever it might be, I always kind of have this sense that like what we have to do is just find that middle again. Like those pendulum swings become so big and extreme in the polarity of it, of like, no, you should only stay home and raise your children. That's the best thing. No, you have to stay working full time. Like there is this like sweet spot that we can all kind of coexist in and agree upon, and kind of know that there is something different for everyone, and all of those things are true at the same time. And how do we really honor those things? There's just so much to unpack in what you said. Like I'm thinking of Bridget Schulte wrote a book called, I think it's called Overwhelmed and Burnt Out. I'll have to, I think it's that, but it's an older book, but it's so good. And it talks a lot about this idea of feminism and like how women really struggled then, like once you adopted this idea that like, okay, you can have a seat at the table, it became sort of almost impossible to then say, well, I actually want to pause too and be able to raise my family and have this time for me and my family. So I feel like your book is such a nice complement to that, because it really goes into the what's next. So I was thinking about your work because you started before COVID, and now here we are post-COVID. So I'm really curious to know, I mean, I have my own thoughts on this, but what do you think COVID did collectively in terms of this messaging around a pause, this messaging around going, maybe there's something else I could be doing? Because that was sort of what I think the takeaway was for a lot of people. But I'd be really curious to know what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I think I got a front row seat to it in part because, yes, I started this work in 2016, 2017. I launched on January 10th, 2017. And, there was an irony in running a platform about career pauses while I was on a career pause. And so it was really about planting the seeds for this work. But there were times, I wrote the one-pager about what this book was going to be in 2018. Because I was looking at the data, and there was more and more data saying that women, especially millennial women, identified with motherhood in a much more significant way, meaning that they wanted motherhood to be a more significant part of their identity. Except they were saying the same thing about work, and at some point that becomes unsustainable, right? Like at some point there, we do have to shift priorities at different times, and we were starting to see the rise of freelance and entrepreneurship, and so we were seeing it, but you have to look hard for it, and the lean in movement was still on like a pretty significant high, and then 2020 happened, and I think what ended up happening was that no one ever asked again, even though they may say it in conversation out of habit, what do stay-at-home parents do all day, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were squashed together with their kids. Everyone got a front row seat to what parenting includes and the day-to-day of that. We started to see new ways to make work work. We started to see how work wasn't working for family life. And I think it created this collective re-examination of work and family. And in that re-examination, a lot of people called it the Great Resignation, right? We saw
Yeah.
a lot more women leaving the workforce, and it brought up the question about how the workforce wasn't set up for families.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we've seen women return, actually now women are back in the workforce at rates that that surpass what they were pre-pandemic. It's now in the zeitgeist to question how it's all working. And I think, where we are now is this interesting moment of forging new paths and new ways. And it feels like we're so ripe and tender and squishy, and we're figuring things out, right? Like things are a little bit, like you see companies walking back their remote policies, and then you see layoffs, and then you see, so there's a lot that feels fragile in the economy right now. And equally, I do think we're sitting at a really interesting moment. I mean, this is the first time caregiving and sort of the cost of care
Mm-hmm.
is seeing support across both aisles, right? Like, politically. And so
Yeah.
it's finally getting the attention it deserves. I would say, I think we've really come a long way in seeing the value of care, right? Like we're starting to say, well, this is how much it actually costs the economy, or how much the economy owes unpaid caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
Where I still think we have a ways to go is still dignifying that work and saying this is actually intellectual labor and emotional labor and leadership training. And if a parent is on a career sabbatical for family life, they're actually still growing. And that's obviously the work that we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think I saw the shift happen. I was in leadership when COVID hit, and I was in the medical field, so we didn't really pause for very long. We went back very fast, but in even that brief pause is when I sort of started to say to myself, what would it be like if I started writing? And that's sort of how my journey began. And then I got asked to write an article for, I think it was the Detroit Jewish News, about like just a reflection on this period in time, or in this moment in time.
Yeah.
And it resonated with a lot of readers. And then from there I wrote and continued to write. But it was interesting because had that not, that kind of sacred pause, or the power pause, as you put it, is not just applicable to like a new mom or a new parent. It's really applicable to so many instances in our lives where we just don't slow down enough to take that pause and give ourselves permission to take that pause, and then kind of look to see what comes up when it's there. And it was in that moment, like after I returned, we were working from home, but once we physically went back, it was like a 2-month-ish pause at that point. And even in that brief moment, I sort of knew something opened up, something was revealed. And so I agree with you. I think in people, in that time, people were looking at the sustainability of the workforce in terms of like balancing family life and work hours and demands at work, and sort of those boundaries being crossed of like getting phone calls at home after hours, to work on something. So I agree. And I actually think, for better or for worse, in a lot of ways, it was good for that revelation to happen. It was good to sort of see these faulty systems and where to go from there. So I love the fact that in the book you really do give a lot of tangible tools. So I wanted to start with, like, this conversation comes up a lot with my friends and I'm 45. So I think for me, there are a lot of people who get to their, like, right near 40, I would say, and they start to go, I don't even like the job I'm in. And they've been doing it for a really long time. So what do you say to the person who wants to entertain a pause, but is really afraid of that financial burden, or the idea that they might take a financial hit, or that they just can't? Like, where do we kind of help the person who just feels terribly stuck in the in-between of what to do?
Well, I would actually say you answered the question in the in-between, right? I think that there's, the gray area, the goal with the gray area is that we're offering more options. And so for women and men who want more room and headspace for family life. I've met so many who say, you know what, I can't financially afford this pause. And I want this headspace. So I'm going to not take that promotion, or I'm not going to take on more management duties, or I'm going to see if I can shift my role so that it's on a project basis or a contract basis where, or a part-time basis where I can stay connected to X amount of income, but still have boundaries to allow me to be present for my family in the way I need or want to be, right? So my point being that if it is not financially possible to make room for family life, there are many ways to make room for family life. And, I think that part of the thought exercise of planning for a career break is that intentional dialogue. Those tricky money conversations are the most important conversations you can have. And we obviously offer significant scripts around that. But, at a high level, it's about making sure that you're prioritizing at least 3 to 6 months out, expressing why you want this shift, getting on the same page with your partner about how this impacts and benefits the whole household system, because it's really important to remember that it's a joint household, right? And so if one partner is pausing their paid work or shifting their paid work to make room to hold up more of the caregiving responsibilities and the family administration, that actually benefits the partner working out of the home. And the partner working out of the home is now equally dependent on that partner doing unpaid work. And so, that mindset, that agreement ahead of time, the budgeting and the shifts, I've seen people have to go as extreme as moving locations to afford one partner. I just recently met a woman who left the Upper West Side of Manhattan to move to Philadelphia because that would afford them the ability for her to be able to take a career pause. I've heard that numerous times, and I've also heard sort of smaller lifestyle shifts where it's cutting back on travel and cutting back on other discretionary expenses to live a simpler life for a chapter, to make room for this other priority for the family. The goal really, though, is that it's a joint household decision. Both partners are very clear of the value that they're both contributing, so that when and if they're sort of coming back to this decision, they both feel like they're equally making trade-offs to make this work, and that they both have access to that income so they can invest it in themselves as well to stay whole and healthy. The one thing we don't want to see is someone say, okay, I want to be home, so I'm going to not afford myself a haircut, and I'm not going to afford myself a coffee, and it's like all on me to sort of you're not a piggy bank during this time. You are a whole and functioning parent, and you deserve to be whole and healthy to run the household. And so the goal really is to think about, how are we together making the right decision, and how are we exploring all the options that could make this work for us?
Yeah, I love all of that so much, and I love how you help families navigate those conversations. I think money conversations in particular can feel tricky, so I love that in the book there are a lot of, you just give people the exact place to start, which I think is the hardest part. Once you get
100%.
going and you're like, okay, we're in it, we're talking, we're planning, I think we can kind of cruise once that happens. It's that beginning, it's that initiating those conversations that just can feel really daunting and scary, and you really kind of hold people's hand through that process, and I think that's so remarkable. I know one of my favorite things, Neha, that you said when you were at the Detroit event was somebody had talked about, and I think this is very commonly experienced, but talked about during her shift, she sort of took what she perceived as maybe a demotion, like doing something that was not quite what she was doing, but it was less hours, and in an effort to sort of strike this balance, she decided to take it. And I loved your response to her, and I'll have you kind of elaborate on it, but you told her, let's think about it not in that way, but let's look at you collecting experiences. And I was like, oh, that's so good. I even made a note of it because I thought that can be applicable in so many areas of life. Like, instead of looking at something as quote unquote good or bad, or, kind of categorizing things in this binary way, it's just this idea of enrichment, and how are we, elaborating on that. So anyways, I'd love to hear a little bit more about somebody listening to this who says, oh, that's me, I just literally took this step down, or whatever, however it is they perceive it. How do you help them better understand it as a collection of experiences?
Well, if I remember correctly, she was also asking about reconciling her own ambition.
Yes, exactly.
And I remember saying to her, which I say often, that I remember feeling when I was sort of holding my own project alongside family life and thinking, oh, I like really should be doing more. I should be doing more. Does this not make me ambitious? And I looked up ambition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it was defined as the determination to do. That's it. It was like the act of doing.
Yes.
And by that definition, you are still doing, no matter what your work and family equation is. You just shifted your priorities to do a great many things with care and determination. And so, what I offered to her, and I would offer to anyone, whether they are pausing or they're shifting their work or they're downshifting their work, is if you're making that decision consciously, to be able to make room for other priorities. By nature of that, you are ambitious because you're designing your life to do work aligned with your values, right? And then I think to your second question, which is how does that fit into this sort of larger career story? I think what I'm often asked is, well, how do I speak about these shifts, whether you took a full pause or you took a downshift? And how do I make sense of them in my career story? And I think where we're moving away and starting to see more acceptance is the nonlinear career, right? Where all of your experience before and all of your accomplishments do not disappear overnight. They go with you. And then you have, layer on top of that, your new experiences and your non-traditional experiences. And maybe that is a full career sabbatical for family life. But I encourage everyone to really audit all of those experiences, whether you do that every quarter or every month, keep that running list in a spreadsheet, keep it in your notes app, and you might write, negotiated with a 12-year-old, or got off the phone with a medical insurance company and finally won that claim for my child with type 1 diabetes, or facilitated a benefit for the school and fundraised over $100,000, right? And, when you start to do that, what you're able to do is look back on this time in life, and maybe you don't write all of those details, but you start to extract from it the stories and the experiences that help shape your career portfolio, including all of those traditional experiences before, but layering on top of that the ones that speak to your creativity, your empathy, your communication, your community involvement, your impact. And I think that can be a really powerful story as long as you give yourself the chance to own it.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of when I work with parents, I teach them I do this thing called a check-in and check back to do once a week, and it just is like checking in with yourself in the moment, presently, and then like checking back with what worked, what didn't, things like that. But then in addition to that, we always think about like parenting wins, because it's so easy. The human psyche, our brain is really wired to sort of sit and stew over what's not working, what isn't going well, and sometimes we forget all the good moments and the challenges that we overcame and the things that we were able to succeed in. And so I think, like you say, this audit, this idea of really being able to look back and go like, wow, look at what I just did, and just being able to sort of build that experience that way, and just to remind yourself of just how expansive you really are and what you can really do. So I often wonder, Elise Lunan, who I've had on the podcast, and I'm a big fan of her work, and I feel like as you're talking, like her book and your book, I think can really go hand in hand. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
I had her on for our summer book club, and we have a nice relationship and great conversation, because I think she is also dismantling the tropes that hold women back.
Totally, yeah. I love her book. And anyways, I was thinking about it as I was reading, your work, and I was, as I've gotten to know you and have been familiar with your work, and then with Elise's work, it's really beautiful that these conversations are happening. And one of the things that I think she had said on her podcast, and I think this is true for me, is often the books that we write or the work that we do find us, rather than like us seeking that. And so I kind of look at you like from a bird's eye view, and I think to myself, like, she very much is living her message. Like you are really in it. You're really kind of in it and sharing, and in it and sharing. So what do you think, personally speaking, if you feel comfortable sharing with us, like how has the Power Pause shifted things for you? Because I feel like it's probably pretty tremendous.
It is tremendous, and I don't think it's that different from most of the women in our community. You're looking at me 9 years in. I'm 40, and when I had my first, that's, I thought that my career was fully in brand marketing, and I thought my self-worth was wrapped up in what I did. And then I had a child, and I was able to set new goals for myself about how do I let go of other people's approval and their expectations to really do what works for myself and my family. And that ends up becoming a superpower, right?
Yes.
Because then as soon as you part with that ego, then you give yourself permission to experiment. And for years I'd wanted to be a writer and build content and community and gather women, and that didn't sort of fit in the work that I was doing, and the fancy titles that came with it. And then I let myself play and explore because I was already doing that in motherhood. And I think that was a huge gift because it let me plant the seeds for this work that took a long time, right? I think it challenged me to have to redefine success over and over, because for a long time this work didn't make money, and didn't look optically big, and yet I knew it was important. I knew I was learning. I knew it kept me feeling connected to women. I knew it helped me feel impactful. So I think my relationship to work changed. I think my relationship to myself and my own sort of clarity on how to own the choices I'm making and walk through this world without a need for approval became a huge gift. And I think the personal work of parenting, I mean, you know this better than anyone, that there is no bigger motivator to grow into the best version of yourself, or at least to grow, than children. And, that is probably the deepest work I do. And, whether that was for me, it was reactivity, it was patience, it was, and I wanted that from my experience in parenting. And that is, there's so much self-healing. And I think our generation talks about that a lot. And that's sort of the real emotional side of parenting, right?
Yeah.
So, I think a lot of people talk about losing themselves in motherhood, especially in stay-at-home motherhood. And I just want to flip that script that, from age 5 to 15, we grow. From 15 to 25, we grow. And it's only natural to grow. You will change. I don't think it's losing yourself as much as it's opening yourself up to this next evolution.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that so much. And I think, a lot of times, even in my own work, there's, this idea of like, as we parent, we usually want this very prescriptive plan of like, do this, your child will stop doing that. And it's like, actually, it always starts with us. So like, what's the thing that we need to still heal? What's the thing that's still coming to the surface? What is underneath the reactivity? And sometimes parents are really on board, and sometimes they're like, that's not why I wanted you to help me, and so it's fair, I get it. But I think the work of parenting is really to continue to grow, and not just your children, but to continue to grow yourself and to parent yourself and to grow alongside your kids in all the ways that they need and all the ways that you need. And so it's this dance really that takes place. And I think you've given permission to so many mothers to be able to do that in the way that they need and in the way that their families need. And I think up until your work, really, there wasn't anybody saying that. There was just people saying like, choose a side and stick with it. Like, you're either on team A or team B. And again, those binary thoughts, similar to Elisa's work, right? Like undoing some of those subconscious beliefs that we might hold on to. So my last question, and I'll kind of leave the listeners with this, but what is your hope once people kind of get this book? And I know so many people are going to read it. When I mentioned even on Instagram and on TikTok that I'm going to have you on, the questions and the people, the excitement, you're clearly, your work is resonating, and they were like, oh my gosh, and tell me when it's coming out. And, I post about my podcast a lot, and I don't always get that kind of response. So I'm curious to know, and I say this as a fellow writer and as somebody who is kind of just embarking on this journey of trying to write my own book. What is your hope once people sit down and have this book in their hands and maybe they finish reading it? What is your hope from there? What would you love to see?
I really do hope that this book gives women a sense of open-mindedness to this stage of life and a sense of possibility that can help them walk through a really beautiful stage of life with a little bit more confidence, a little bit more ease. And I really hope from a sort of large cultural perspective that this finally undoes
Mhm.
some of these really old tropes that have hunted women from making the right choice for them and their families for right now. And I hope we sort of dismantle this sort of black and white, these boxes that we try to put people in, and just embrace a much more fluid journey for work and ambition and family and womanhood.
Yeah, I love that so much, and I think that will happen. I'm so grateful for your work. I know so many other people are, and I think I'm excited that we're going to have your book and we're going to be able to read it. I hope women sort of book club around it is like what I see in my dreams for your book, is that there's conversation of women, and even men, like this idea. It's interesting as I was leaving my career, I was in pediatrics and the medical side of speech therapy, and I would say in the couple of years before I left, you started to see a lot more dads coming by themselves for evaluations, and the mothers were not there. And those things didn't exist initially when I started, and those things didn't happen. So I think there is this sort of shift in what's happening, shift in conversations, shift in the culture, and I think that's what we need to see. But it starts with voices like yours. It starts with mothers being able to say, "Hey, I'm okay with this. I'm going to give myself permission to do this or follow this path or follow my gut on this one." And I think you really provide a roadmap for people to do that, and a really clear and a way that has a lot of integrity and grace to it. So, yeah, I could talk to you forever. Thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate your time. I know people are going to love the episode, but they're mostly going to love your book and your work. So, congratulations on your book and all the good things coming.
Oh, Albiona, thank you so much. And thank you for adding your voice to the movement.
Oh, I appreciate it.